Today we explore something appearing everywhere, in families, culture, relationships, and even in contemporary media, like Apple TV's Pluribus. This presentation examines how we navigate truth when everyone, including ourselves, exists within activated trauma responses. We'll journey through the collapse of basic trust, Jungian one-sidedness, shadow projection, and the activation of personal and collective complexes, then discover how Carl Jung's idea of the transcendent function offers a way forward. Hi, I'm Dr. Bren, and I hope you enjoy this video. I know it's long, but it holds the key to understanding how to step out of trauma and live an abundant and creative life. You will find many more videos like this one inside my free school community called the Jungian Genius Circle. How do we find truth when everyone, including us, is caught in trauma responses? This central question demands we look beyond trauma itself. We must examine the collapse of basic trust, Jungian one-sidedness, shadow projection, and the activation of personal and collective complexes. Only then can we understand how the transcendent function allows us to find our way out of this labyrinth of reactivity and confusion. The answer lies not in avoiding trauma, but in understanding the psychological architecture that trauma dismantles and how consciousness can be restored. We begin at the foundation. Basic trust isn't a belief system, religious faith, or intellectual conviction. It precedes all of these. Basic trust is the psychoid ground from which the ego emerges. The felt sense that existence itself is fundamentally coherent and that you belong to reality. This foundational trust forms in early development through consistent, attuned caregiving. When present, it allows the psyche to remain open, curious, and capable of holding complexity. When absent, the entire psychological structure becomes unstable. Basic trust represents embodied coherence, a somatic knowing that life makes sense and you are safe enough to exist authentically. This isn't cognitive. It's a felt sense in the nervous system. Most of us did not grow up with this intact. Instead, we encountered unpredictability, fear, chaos, or conditional love that taught us the world is fundamentally unsafe. Many of us grew up like Job in the biblical narrative, faithful, earnest, doing everything possible, yet still meeting abandonment, unpredictability, or betrayal. This creates what I call the cosmic abandonment wound, the deep knowing that even your best efforts cannot guarantee safety, love, or coherence. This wound shatters basic trust at its foundation. When basic trust collapses, the ego loses its ground. Without this psychoid anchor, the ego becomes frightened, defensive, and desperately seeks stability through control, certainty, and rigid categorization. Jung said very clearly, "A frightened ego becomes one-sided. It cannot hold nuance, symbol, or complexity. It collapses into survival." Jung understood that when the ego feels existentially threatened, it abandons its natural flexibility and capacity for symbolic thinking. The terrified ego cannot tolerate ambiguity, paradox, or the tension of opposites. Instead, it splits reality into stark binaries: safe versus unsafe, right versus wrong, us versus them. This one-sidedness is not a moral failure. It's a survival response, but it marks the beginning of psychic illness and the loss of access to deeper truth. When basic trust breaks, psyche collapses into survival. We all know these states: fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. We recognize these survival states intimately. They're automatic, physiological, and override conscious thinking. They override empathy, curiosity, and access to truth. These responses kept our ancestors alive, but in modern relational contexts, they create profound disconnection and suffering. Jung adds a crucial insight that trauma literature often misses. When we are in a survival state, we lose connection to the self, the deeper center of consciousness that transcends the ego. In survival mode, we lose access to clarity, intuition, symbol, imagination, and meaning. We become trapped in literal, concrete, reactive consciousness. The symbolic function, Jung's gateway to transformation, becomes completely inaccessible. Trauma collapses consciousness into binaries. All or nothing thinking replaces nuance. Fear, constant scanning for threats dominates awareness. Projection, internal contents become externalized onto others. Urgency, everything becomes an emergency requiring immediate response. Emotional contagion, effect spreads unconsciously through groups and systems. This is precisely where shadow material begins to spill out unconsciously. The traumatized psyche cannot contain what it cannot consciously process. Shadow and one-sidedness, the world becomes threat. Jung states clearly that one-sidedness is the beginning of psychic illness. When the ego is terrified and has lost its ground in basic trust, it must create artificial stability through splitting reality into manageable categories. This splitting is not conscious. It happens automatically as a defensive maneuver. Safe versus unsafe. The world divides into protection and threat, right versus wrong. Moral certainty replaces ethical complexity. Good versus evil. Absolute categories eliminate gray areas. Me versus them. Identity becomes defined by opposition. This is exactly where shadow projection emerges as the dominant psychological mechanism. Unable to tolerate ambiguity or integrate disowned aspects of self, the traumatized ego externalizes everything threatening, everything inside us that we cannot tolerate. Our rage, vulnerability, shame, need, sexuality, aggression, or helplessness becomes the other. The projection mechanism transforms internal conflict into external threat. This happens inside families when one member becomes the identified patient. It happens in politics when opposing parties embody all evil. It happens internally when one part of the psyche attacks another. And in trauma, this projection happens instantly and unconsciously. We externalize what we cannot feel. The shadow isn't what we hate in others. It's what we cannot bear to recognize in ourselves. Complexes. When the trauma takes over, now we descend deeper into Jung's most powerful and least understood concept, the complex. This is where trauma becomes an autonomous psychological entity with its own agenda, its own emotional tone, and its own will to dominate consciousness. Carl Jung said, "A complex is a fragmented piece of the psyche with its own will. A complex is not simply a memory or a feeling. It's a splinter of consciousness, a fragment that's separated from the ego during an overwhelming experience. This fragment contains emotion, imagery, somatic sensation, and narrative, all organized around a core wound or theme. The complex exists as a sub-personality, with its own autonomy. When activated, it seizes control of consciousness, and the ego becomes its vehicle. A complex operates through specific characteristics that make it recognizable when activated, emotional, carries intense affect disproportionate to present circumstance, reactive, triggers automatically without conscious choice, irrational, immune to logic, evidence, or reason, repetitive, creates the same patterns across different contexts, contagious, spreads through emotional fields to affect others. When we are triggered, the complex seizes the ego completely. In those moments, we are not driving our own consciousness. We are being driven by this autonomous fragment. How to recognize it when you are possessed. Your voice changes. Tone, pitch, rhythm, shift. You sound unlike yourself. Your perception narrows. Tunnel vision replaces peripheral awareness and context. You're not you. Later you think, that wasn't me, or I don't know what happened. You've been taken over. Someone or something else is operating your consciousness. These signs indicate complex possession. In these moments, your capacity for choice, empathy, and clear perception disappears. You become the complex expression, not your own expression. When a complex is activated, it doesn't remain isolated within one person. It radiates outward energetically and emotionally, creating what I call a trauma field, an invisible but palpable zone of emotional gravity that pulls other people into its orbit. Families create trauma fields that span generations. Groups create them that define institutional culture. Cultures create them that shape entire societies. Once inside a trauma field, individual consciousness becomes subordinate to the collective emotional state. Let me say that again. Once inside a trauma field, individual consciousness becomes subordinate to the collective emotional state. Apple TV's Pluribus dramatizes exactly this dynamic. The protagonist, Carol, exists clearly in a trauma response. Her past wounds have activated a complex that now possesses her perception entirely. But the show's brilliance lies in what happens next. The group merges with her emotional field. Her trauma becomes their trauma. The group adopts her emotional state as their own reality. Her fear becomes their perception. They begin seeing threats through her traumatized lens. Her narrative becomes their narrative. Her story about reality replaces their independent assessment. This sequence happens rapidly and unconsciously. The group doesn't decide to merge. They are pulled into the gravitational field of her activated, complex, individual consciousness dissolves into collective possession. This is what Jung warned about throughout his work. Collective possession when an entire group fuses around a shadow projection or shared fear, losing individual consciousness in service of the complex. We see this in political movements, religious fundamentalism, family enmeshment, cult dynamics, and national conflicts. The complex becomes the organizing principle of group consciousness, and anyone who questions it becomes the enemy. This is not unity, empathy, spiritual, merging, collective, intelligence, community. This is trauma-based fusion, a counterfeit oneness, a hive mind created by fear, loss of individual consciousness, psychological contagion. True unity preserves individual consciousness while creating connection. Collective possession erases individual consciousness through emotional contagion and shared defense. It feels like belonging, but it's actually dissolution. The inner critic, the false voice of spirit. Inside the individual, something parallel occurs. When basic trust breaks, the psyche cannot trust itself or reality. In this vacuum, a compensatory structure emerges, what Jung called the negative father complex, and what we commonly know as the inner critic. The inner critic's tactics condemns, declares you fundamentally flawed or wrong, shames, attacks your worth and belonging, commands, issues rigid imperatives that must be obeyed, moralizes, frames everything as moral failure or righteousness, catastrophizes, predicts doom and punishment for mistakes, impersonates, mimics God, conscience, intuition, or truth. The inner critic feels like truth because it speaks with absolute authority. It sounds wise, protective, spiritual, or necessary. But this voice represents the internalized trauma field, the superego possessed by the complex. This is trauma's voice, not the self. The inner critic is the internal hive mind, the ego possessed by the punitive superego, perpetuating the original wounding through self-attack. It maintains the trauma bond internally. ensuring you never feel safe enough to heal. This brings us to the heart of our inquiry, the question that underlies all therapeutic work, all depth psychology, all attempts to live authentically in a world saturated with trauma responses. If Carol is in trauma, and the group is in trauma, and your family is in trauma, and society is in trauma, where is the truth? The Jungian answer. Truth is never inside the complex. Truth is never inside the trauma field. This is Jung's radical and often misunderstood assertion. When consciousness is possessed by a complex, whether personal or collective, it cannot access truth. The complex can only perceive reality through its own distortion, its own emotional coloring, its own defensive narrative. The complex masquerades as truth while actually serving its own perpetuation. It claims to protect you while keeping you trapped in repetition. Truth only appears in the tension of the opposites, and that tension creates the transcendent function. Jung's concept of the transcendent function describes how consciousness evolves beyond one-sided positions. When the ego can hold two opposing truths simultaneously without collapsing into either extreme, a third position emerges, not as compromise, but as genuine synthesis that transcends both polarities. This requires extraordinary psychological capacity, the ability to tolerate tension, ambiguity, paradox, and not knowing without rushing to resolution. Truth arises from the part of you that exists outside the fear, outside the reaction, outside the fusion. This is consciousness accessing the self rather than being possessed by the ego's defenses. Truth arises when we can witness it without being consumed by it, when we can pause between stimulus and response, when we can feel without collapsing into emotional dysregulation, when we can tolerate uncertainty and remain present in the unknowing, and when we can hold two disparate things at once, maintaining the paradox without splitting into binaries. This is the self, not the ego. The self, Jung's term for the totality of the psyche beyond ego consciousness, represents the source of genuine knowing. While the ego splits reality to maintain control, the self holds wholeness. While the complex reacts from wounding, the self responds from centeredness. Accessing the self requires the ego to release its grip on certainty, control, and defensive positioning. This feels dangerous to the traumatized ego, and that's precisely why basic trust is foundational. Armoring. Why? We can't access the self. When traumatized, here we arrive at the missing bridge in Jung's work, the piece he never fully articulated, but which proves essential for understanding the transcendent function. The body holds the key. When trauma hits, the body's response is immediate and total. Muscles tighten into protective contraction. Breath shortens to shallow chest breathing. Awareness narrows to threat-focused tunnel vision. Everything braces for impact or attack. This armoring serves survival. It prepares the organism for fight, flight, or freeze. But it also creates a physiological cage that prevents access to expanded consciousness. The key. Jung missed. A braced body cannot hold the tension of the opposites. A braced ego cannot perceive the symbolic third. Jung described the transcendent function beautifully, but never connected it explicitly to somatic state. The nervous system in defensive arousal cannot access symbolic consciousness, cannot tolerate ambiguity, cannot hold paradox. The armored body keeps the ego locked in literal, concrete, defensive thinking. This is why trauma work requires body-based approaches. Insight alone cannot create the conditions for the transcendent function to emerge. The first step toward truth is not thinking, it is softening. Before we can think clearly, feel authentically, or perceive accurately, we must soften the armoring that maintains traumatic consciousness. This isn't bypassing or avoiding. It's creating the physiological conditions that make integration possible. We soften by breathing slowly and deeply, unclenching muscular tension and creating internal spaciousness. Only when the body softens can the psyche access its deeper resources. Only when the nervous system down-regulates can symbolic consciousness emerge. Only then does the transcendent function become possible. This is embodied psychological work, not merely cognitive insight, but the restoration of somatic groundedness that allows consciousness to expand beyond defensive splitting. Rebuilding basic trust, the way out of collective madness. Now we turn toward healing. If basic trust is the foundation that trauma destroys, how do we rebuild it? The answer contradicts our cultural emphasis on willpower, positive thinking, and belief. How basic trust returns. Basic trust does not return through belief, affirmation, or willpower. These are ego strategies that actually bypass the wound. Basic trust returns through embodied experience that contradicts the original trauma. Presence, consistent, non-abandoning attention from another human being. Safety, predictable, non-threatening environments that allow the nervous system to rest. Relational warmth, experiences of being seen, valued, and held emotionally. Grounding, physical connection to body, earth, and present moment. Somatic release, allowing the body to complete interrupted defensive responses. Inner spaciousness, the gradual restoration of internal room to breathe and be. Basic trust is the psychoid ground of the self. It is the place where intuition and truth live. Jung used the term psychoid to describe the realm where psyche and soma unite, where psychological and physical reality merge into one undifferentiated ground. Basic trust exists in this psychoid realm. It's neither purely psychological nor purely physical. It's the somatic psychological foundation from which consciousness emerges. When this ground is stable, intuition flows naturally. We know what's true without needing to defend our knowing. We can trust our perceptions without constant second-guessing. The self becomes accessible because the ego is no longer consumed with survival. The inner critic loses authority. Its voice becomes recognizable as trauma, not truth. The shadow becomes visible. Projected content can be withdrawn and owned. Projection pulls back. Others are no longer carriers of your disowned parts. The complex loosens. Its grip on consciousness weakens. The opposites can be held. Paradox becomes tolerable rather than threatening. The transcendent function activates. A third position emerges beyond splitting. When basic trust returns, even partially, even momentarily, it initiates a cascade of psychological shifts. Each element reinforces the others, creating an upward spiral toward integration rather than the downward spiral of fragmentation. This is how the psyche returns to coherence. This is how truth returns, not through force, not through belief, not through insight alone, but through the gradual restoration of the somatic, psychological foundation that trauma destroyed. When we feel safe enough in our bodies and our relationships, consciousness naturally expands beyond defensive splitting. Now we can see the complete arc, the descent into trauma and collective possession, and the ascent back toward truth and integration. This is not a linear process, but a spiral, often requiring multiple passes through the same territory at deeper levels. This is the way out of the false hive mind, or what Jung called collective possession. The descent, trauma collapses. Basic trust, loss of basic trust creates one-sidedness. One-sidedness activates the shadow. Shadow activates complexes. Complexes possess individuals and groups. Possession creates the false hive mind. This descent happens unconsciously and rapidly. Once initiated, each stage amplifies the next until consciousness is completely subordinated to the trauma complex. This pivot represents the moment when we recognize that transformation requires not just psychological insight, but somatic shift. The work becomes embodied, relational, and oriented toward safety rather than understanding alone. The critical recognition is armoring prevents the transcendent function. The body's defensive contraction keeps consciousness trapped in splitting and reactivity. Softening creates space. When the body releases, consciousness can expand beyond one-sided positions. The ascent starts with reestablishing basic trust by softening and releasing the armoring. This in turn reconnects us to the self, which reveals the truth and dissolves the trauma field. The ascent requires patience, consistency, and support. It cannot be rushed or bypassed. Each stage must be lived through and integrated before the next becomes possible. But when it occurs, it represents genuine psychological transformation. This is the way out of repetition, madness, the compulsive patterns that keep us trapped in the same conflicts, the same wounds, the same defenses. These dissolve when we address their root in collapsed basic trust and complex possession. We stop repeating trauma and start living from consciousness. This is the way out of the narcissistic field. Whether personal narcissism or collective narcissistic systems, the underlying dynamic is the same. A wound to basic trust creates an ego structure dependent on control, admiration, and the elimination of otherness. Healing the foundational wound dissolves the narcissistic defense. This is the way out of collective confusion. When societies, institutions, families, or groups exist in trauma fields with activated complexes, truth becomes impossible to discern. The path out begins with individuals who do their own work, softening armoring, rebuilding basic trust, accessing the self, and thereby refusing to participate in collective possession. Truth lives outside the trauma field, in the self, in basic trust, and in the transcendent function. This is the foundation of all depth psychological work. We cannot think our way to truth while possessed by complexes. We cannot believe our way past trauma while armored against feeling. We cannot force healing through willpower alone. Instead, we create conditions in our bodies, our relationships, our consciousness, where truth can emerge naturally. We soften, we ground, we witness, we hold opposites, and we trust the self's capacity to reveal what is real. And that is what we are recovering together. This work is not solitary. While each person must do their own inner work, healing occurs in relationship and community. We rebuild basic trust through experiencing trustworthiness in others. We learn to hold paradox by witnessing others hold it. We access the self by recognizing it reflected in authentic human connection. The trauma field dissolves not through heroic individual effort, but through collective commitment to consciousness, embodiment, and truth. This is how families heal. This is how cultures transform. This is how we find our way home to reality. Thank you for being part of this recovery.